Hi, I am Professor Filip Kovacevic, and this is the first edition of Russian Newspaper Monitor. If you listen to the US mass media, you would not know it. But there is quite a lot of pluralism in the Russian newspaper media landscape. This means that different political views are represented on the mass media scene in Russia. As you will see in the show, there are newspapers which support Putin and the Russian government, and at the same time, there are newspapers which are critical of him and his policies from different political perspectives, from the pro-Western press on one side to the communist press on the other side. And these are not some minor publications and websites, but genuine mass-produced newspapers. And we will examine some of their stories on the show. Today, since this is the first edition, I would like to begin by giving you an overview of the Russian newspaper media scene. Basically, today I'll talk about who is who of the Russian newspapers. This is very important for understanding the stories that they publish, of course. So let me begin with the Rossiyskaya Gazeta. Literally, it means Russian newspaper. This newspaper is 100% owned by the Russian government. It publishes the official statements, rules, regulations, decrees, laws, and so on. The RG, as I will call it, communicates the official position of the Russian presidential administration of Vladimir Putin, the Russian government of Dmitry Medvedev, the Russian parliament, which is called the State Duma, and so on. Obviously, all articles are editorially approved by the government officials. So basically, when you read RG, you get to know what Vladimir Putin wants to tell the people of Russia and the world at large. The second newspaper I'd like to talk about is called Izvestia, literally the news or the news reports. During the Soviet period, Izvestia was the official newspaper of the Soviet government, which is the role that the RG is playing for the Russian government today. At the same time, Pravda, which literally means truth, was the official newspaper of the Soviet Communist Party. So during the First Cold War, in the United States, there was a popular saying, there is no truth in Pravda and there is no news in Izvestia. But look around you today. Is the US mass media landscape any better? At this time, Izvestia is a pro-government newspaper, but it is more nuanced than the RG. The next newspaper I'd like to mention is called Newsbud Gazeta. Literally, it means independent newspaper. This is a highbrow intellectual publication which is moderately pro-government, but it has some occasional critique. It is basically the middle-of-the-road newspaper with interesting, in-depth stories. Number 4 newspaper I'll talk about is called the Kommersant, literally the businessman. This is a liberal business newspaper. Its editorial position is to support open markets, free trade, and capitalist globalization. Obviously, it is at times critical of Putin's foreign and security policies, because its journalists and correspondents are linked to the pro-Western and Western centers of power outside of Russia. In the mid-1990s, Kommersant was owned by Boris Berezovsky, who was one of the richest people in Russia. Due to serious disagreements with Putin, Berezovsky had to leave Russia, and he lived in London for a while and died under what many consider suspicious circumstances in 2013. The next newspaper I'd like to talk about is called Novaya Gazeta. Literally, it means the new newspaper. And this is the main Russian liberal opposition newspaper. It is very critical of Putin's domestic and foreign policies. Novaya Gazeta features investigative stories on high-level corruption and abuse of power in Russia. It is owned in part by the employees and in part by Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the last leader of the Soviet Union, but has built an extensive network in the West since the early 1990s. Novaya Gazeta cooperates closely with the Western mass media and publishes New York Times International Weekly every Friday. Several of its journalists were killed in the line of duty. Novaya Gazeta is published 3 times a week. And lastly, Pravda, literally truth. It is still the main newspaper of the Russian Communist Party, which is now an opposition party in Russia. Pravda is very critical of Putin on domestic and economic policies, but tends to agree with him on foreign policy and international positions. Just like Novaya Gazeta, it is published 3 times a week. Now let me say something about the semi-tabloid press in Russia. There is Komsomolskaya Pravda, the Komsomol Truth. By the way, Komsomol was the communist organization of the Soviet youth. The name has remained from the Soviet period, but the ideology is gone. Today, Komsomolskaya Pravda is a daily Russian mass-market semi-tabloid newspaper. It is the best-selling and largest circulation newspaper in the country. It is estimated that it publishes up to 1 million copies every day. It is important to note that whatever the government-owned newspaper, Rossiyskaya Gazeta, or the RG, does not want to publish for various reasons, and yet the government and Putin want it to be known to the Russian people and the world, they give to the KP, Komsomolskaya Pravda. Frequently, KP also publishes alternative interpretations of the world events. And in my opinion, it is also important to consider as another channel of the government's public diplomacy or propaganda, if you will. And lastly, another semi-tabloid publication in Russia is called Argumenti and Fakti, Arguments and Facts. It is published weekly, but it has the largest circulation in Russia. It publishes close to 3 million copies every week. It has been owned by the government of the city of Moscow since 2014. This means that we can expect the government approval for whatever is published, but because it is a mass-market newspaper of the semi-tabloid type, the stories may be more open and direct. Argumenti and Fakti also has a dozen regional editions, which publish the articles of interest for the particular region. For example, the region of Moscow, St. Petersburg, Magadan, Nizhny Novgorod, Omsk, even the Crimea. And considering the international controversy, this edition coming from the Crimea will be especially interesting to analyze and discuss. And now, after I discussed who is who on the Russian media scene, let's look at some actual stories. Let's look at some stories actually published in these newspapers. Let's look at their ideological and political perspective, where they come from, and what they tell us. I'll also be looking at the photos on the front page of these newspapers, because that's also very important, because it can frame the debate. So let's start with the government-owned newspaper, the Rossiyskaya Gazeta, or the RG, as I call it. So on October 5th, 2016, the RG had a front-page article called Damascus Brosheny, which is a play on words on the phrase, the masks dropped. And he talked about the US policy in Syria. And the subtitle of this article was, US bogged down in searching for a new formula for conflict resolution in Syria. It continued, latest statements of the State Department and Pentagon remind of the worst days of the Cold War. So in essence, what we had here is the critique of the recent statements by John Kirby, the State Department spokesman, who, I will remind you, said that there will be attacks of the Islamic extremists on the Russian cities. And he also talked about the return of the Russian soldiers to Russia in body bags.
The consequences are that the civil war will continue in Syria, that extremist groups will continue to exploit the vacuums that are there in Syria to expand their operations, which will include, no question, attacks against Russian interests, perhaps even Russian cities. And Russia will continue to send troops home in body bags.
The article essentially condemned these statements by John Kirby, by the State Department spokesman, and basically said that this is not only beyond any diplomatic decency, but it is also a clear direction to the extremists as what to do. So this is a pretty heavy attack by the Russian government press on the U.S. State Department. The article continues to talk about the spirit of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And I'll remind you that this was the time when the world was on the brink of a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Essentially, what we have is a sharp critique of the U.S. Foreign policy on Syria. It says that the U.S. is already recalling the specialists who were supposed to take part in the operations of the U.S.-Russian center in Syria. And this center was negotiated by Kerry and Lavrov. And its task was supposed to be to monitor the ceasefire and also to enable the exchange of important intelligence data. So the Russians are saying that the only thing that the US is willing to preserve at this point is the mechanism to avoid possible incidents in the Syrian airspace. And for the Russians, this is clearly not enough. The article quotes Sergei Lavrov, and he is quoted as saying that the US-Russian agreement was broken up by those who advocate the use of force in Syria. And Lavrov said that this fraction, this rogue network within the United States administration wanted to break up the peace process from the very beginning. And it's not only that they are not working on separating the so-called moderate opposition from the extremists, as they promised, the US promised, but they're also not deblocking the so-called Castello Road in eastern Aleppo, which according to Lavrov is important for getting the humanitarian aid into the city. Even so, Lavrov stated that Moscow is not giving up, that Moscow is reaching out to the United States, and that the international group on Syria should play a larger role. The article comments that what is taking place at this time represents the failure of all John Kerry's diplomatic efforts. This article implies that Kerry's subordinates are more aggressive than Kerry and are taking the upper hand. And we also have the quote from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which says that Washington is ready to make a deal with the devil, with the terrorists, in order to get what it wants, which is the regime change in Damascus, the getting rid of Assad. At the end, the article mentions the US attack on elite Syrian troops, which took place about 10 days ago, when 62 Syrian soldiers lost their lives and hundreds were wounded. So what we have in this article on the front page of the Russian-controlled, Russian government-controlled newspaper is a sharp critique of the U.S. foreign policy in Russia, with little bit support for John Kerry. In other words, this article is trying to defend John Kerry from some of his subordinates who are described as being more aggressive. The second article in the same issue of the RG that I want to mention praises the work of Vladimir Putin. In fact, it's called Road Without Borders. Talks about the meeting between the leaders of Russia and Kazakhstan. It chronicles Putin's visit to the capital of Kazakhstan, Astana, where he took part in two forums business forum and a forum on regional cooperation. And this is very important because this shows to the readers of this newspaper that Russia is not isolated, that Russia has a lot of friends and allies in Eurasia, and that Kazakhstan, which is one of the biggest states that came out of the former Soviet Union, is a firm ally of Russia and also Putin. So the photo that comes with this article is the shaking of hands between the Kazakhstan president Nazarbayev and Vladimir Putin. They are shaking hands and they are smiling. They are happy to be together. And Putin is quoted extensively. You'll notice that in this newspaper that Putin is quoted extensively, that typically his photograph is either on the front page or on the page number 2 in the newspaper. And here in this article, Putin talks about Kazakhstan being an important strategic partner and ally for Russia. He talks about investments, the Russian investments in Kazakhstan, about $9 billion, and also the reciprocal, the Kazakhstan's investments in Russia, about $3 billion. He also talks about 6,000 joint companies dealing with mining, machine production, chemical industry, and agriculture. What's interesting that Putin emphasizes is that this liberalization of trade within the emerging of Eurasian Economic Union. In other words, what we have in Eurasia at this point is the setting up of some institutions that were being set up in the European Union back in the 50s and 60s. But he says that more remains to be done, especially on the part of Russia, especially the building of infrastructure and the roads to the border between Russia and Kazakhstan. Putin also talks about the opening of the Russian Special Economic Zone in the Urals, about grand infrastructural projects, the highway from Western China to Europe, which could reduce car travel for up to 10 days, and also the trade from China into Europe. So these are some very important developments. What's interesting is that Russia is not developing an isolationist economic strategy. It actually seeks to integrate the bigger Eurasian region under its leadership, and Kazakhstan clearly recognizes the Russian leadership in this respect. It's interesting that Nazarbayev, who is a longtime leader of Kazakhstan, he has been the president of Kazakhstan since the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. So he has been in power for about 25 years. And it's interesting that he commented on the Russian parliamentary elections. And he said to Putin, he praised Putin for the election results. And he also said, and I'm quoting, "Your victory is important for stable development in these difficult times." So we can clearly see that Kazakhstan is closely allied to Russia, and that the U.S. NATO strategy in Central Asia is not functioning the way, for instance, Zbigniew Brzezinski wanted it to function, and the way he described it in his book from the 90s, which is called the Grand Chessboard. Now I'm going to move to the Kommersant, which, as I said, is the liberal business newspaper that is critical of Putin's foreign policy occasionally. And so Kommersant is not talking about this meeting between Putin and Nazarbayev. It's instead focusing on Ukraine. And it essentially has on the front page on October the 6th, has the article entitled "Ukraine Increases Imports of Salt Before the Ban." The article is about the Ukrainian producers of salt who are increasing their supplies because the ban on import from Russia is going to come into force on November 1st. And the article says that the imports of salt were increased by 1.5 times in the last 3 months, and that they concern not only the regular salt, but also the so-called technical salt, which is very important for the winter because it's used on the roads after heavy snowfalls. So in my opinion, this article tries to point out the plight of the Ukrainians in the economic war between Russia and Ukraine. This newspaper, the Kommersant, which means the businessman, on the front page also has the photo of Sergei Kirienko. And Kirienko is the person Putin appointed, just appointed, to the influential post in the presidential administration, which is in charge of domestic politics in Russia. It's interesting that Kirienko was previously the director of Rosatom, which is a state agency in charge of atomic energy. Let me just explain how powerful this position is. It's shown by the fact that Vyacheslav Volodin, who held this position before, was chosen to be the president of the Russian parliament, the State Duma. So somebody who was in this position before the election, Vyacheslav Volodin, now became the president of the Russian parliament. And let me just remind you that the former president of the parliament, Sergei Narishkin, became the new head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Agency, the SVR, the Служба внешней разведки. He's in charge of the Russian spies in foreign lands. And I have an article on that on the Newsbud website, which is called "Why Did the Russian Spies Get a New Boss?", where I explain who Narishkin is and what his policies will probably be in the coming period. Rossiyskaya Gazeta, the RG, I talked about October 5th articles, and now let's talk about the October 6th articles. It's Putin is on the front page. He's giving a speech in the Russian parliament. And for instance, the Kommersant did not put Putin on the front page, but Kirienko, even though they spoke about the same issue. It's another very interesting article on the front page of the RG for October 6th. It talks about Great Britain. And let me remind you that Britain has been the longtime opponent of Russia from the time of the Russian Empire and the British Empire. In fact, the Great Game was a geopolitical struggle between Russia and Britain in Eurasia, and it continues to this day. So this article is very interesting because it's a critique of Great Britain. The title is "Great Britain Wants to Return to the Age of Colonial Wars," and the subtitle is "A License to Kill." And the article is about that the British want to withdraw their soldiers from the jurisdiction of the European Convention for Human Rights. It's based on the report by the British newspaper Guardian about the speech by the British Prime Minister Theresa May and the Minister of Defense Michael Fallon at the Conservative Party convention that took place a couple of days ago. And essentially the purpose is not to allow the British soldiers to be sued for the crimes and abuses of power that they committed in recent wars. For instance, let me just give you one example from the article. In Iraq and Afghanistan, since 2004, the British government had to pay close to £1 million in damages. This article is based on the report in The Guardian, but it also continues. It adds, it is much more critical of the British government than The Guardian because it adds another section which is entitled Facts of History. And in this section, the journalist for the RG, for the Rossiyskaya Gazeta, chronicles the bloody history of the British colonial interventions in South Africa, in India, and in Kenya. For instance, the article mentions that 25 million Indians died of hunger during the British rule of India because tons of wheat and other foodstuffs were exported to Europe. So what we have in the RG consistently on the front pages is a critique. First, the United States, that was 2 days ago, and yesterday was the critique of the British government and their policies. Let me just talk about a couple more articles. Let's cover the Izvestia, which, as I said, is a pro-government, moderately pro-government newspaper. It had a very interesting article in the edition for October 6, 2016. The article is entitled, "A New Division of Heavy Bomber Aircraft Was Formed." And the subtitle says, these aircraft will patrol the Japan, Guam, Hawaii triangle. The article talks about the Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense, finishing the formation of a new aircraft division in the Russian Far East. The Russians are now putting into operations two types of strategic bombers, Tu-95MC and Tu-22M3, and they will be patrolling the waters of the Pacific. And the intention, according to this article, is to let the countries of the Pacific region and also the United States know that Russia is serious about the protection of its eastern borders and interests. And there is a photo on the front page of this newspaper of Izvestia, and the photo is of the aircraft Tu-95MC, which is a strategic bomber, the new generation strategic bomber that the Russian military industry has developed. So this article on the front page of Izvestia is telling the Russian readers and also the world at large that Russia is now going to be projecting its military power not only in Europe and Eurasia, but also in the Pacific. And specifically, it talks about this geographical triangle, Japan, Guam, and Hawaii. And the last, so let's go into the tabloid press. You know, this is interesting. So far we consider kind of the intellectual highbrow newspaper, also the government newspapers. So let's look at some tabloids. Komsomolskaya Pravda, which is a daily newspaper. As I said, every day it publishes up to 1 million copies. It's widely read throughout Russia, and the edition for October the 4th has an article on the beginning of the fall mandatory military conscription in Russia. And there is the photo of a new recruit putting his boots on. Let me note that the draft in Russia is still in existence, as opposed to the United States. It is mandatory in Russia for all Russian men from 18 to 27 years of age. There are some exceptions, like the university students, but generally it is mandatory. It lasts for a whole year. And in fact, it was only in 2008 that the conscription was reduced from 2 years to 1 year. So essentially, Komsomolskaya Pravda is projecting this image, okay, we are getting some new soldiers in our military. And in fact, from what you have seen so far, the Russian newspapers, the government-controlled and the tabloids emphasize the military image of Russia. And also, in Komsomolskaya Pravda, the edition of October 5th, which is the next day, we have the announcement for the radio show of Viktor Barans. And Viktor Barans is the main military analyst for this newspaper. And the topic of this radio show is American weapons in Ukraine. So Viktor Barans, who is the main military analyst for the newspaper, is going to give a show on the American weapons in Ukraine. And there is a photo of him, and he's in uniform. He's in the uniform of a Russian military officer. And let me end the show for today by looking at Pravda. Pravda is the Communist Party newspaper, but at this point of time, the Communist Party is an opposition party in Russia. It's not in power in Russia. So in fact, it's critical. It's critical of Vladimir Putin. This is something that needs to be understood, I think, in the United States, is that there is some opposition to Putin in Russia, and it comes not only from the West, from the Western-supported media, but also from the Communist Party from the inside. So let's just look at the front page of Pravda for October 6th. What we have on the front page is first of all the photos of a memory walk in Moscow commemorating the bloody events of October 1993, 23 years ago, when, let me remind you, there was a violent conflict between the supporters and opponents of Yeltsin, which was ended by Boris Yeltsin, who at the time was the president of Russia. He ordered the tanks to fire on the parliament building. And he was supported in this by the United States and the West. So he was supported to essentially destroy the parliamentary opposition by the use of force. And so the Communist Party, which supported the people who were in the parliament at the time, people who got killed, is now commemorating their sacrifice. So there are photos of the participants carrying the photos of those who were killed. This is on the front page. And also, in addition, there is a photo of the communist leader Gennady Zyuganov, who is giving a speech, and this speech is reproduced in its entirety on the front page. And just let me briefly describe his speech, because this is very important for understanding the political scene in Russia. So Zyuganov is sharply critical not only of Yeltsin, who's dead, and the oligarchs. He claims that these oligarchs and Yeltsin were controlled by the CIA for the destruction of the Soviet Union. He even speaks about some 60 CIA agents which controlled Russia in the early 90s. He also criticizes the current government of Russia, and by implication also Vladimir Putin, for rigging, for stealing the recent parliamentary elections. Zyuganov claims that the election results were known even before the elections were held. So he is not mentioning Putin by name, but he's criticizing the election results and also the government of Russia, which is led by Dmitry Medvedev. And Zyuganov, in the end, also accuses the government for the horrible management of the economy, because the GDP fell by 4% during the last year. It's interesting to note that Zyuganov's speech is full of the nostalgia for the Soviet Union and for the Soviet strong political and economic position in the world. Also on the front page of Pravda, at the same time, for the same edition, we have the photo and description of a recent social protest in Greece against the austerity measures of the Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras, who ironically was elected precisely in order to eliminate those austerity measures. But unfortunately, his political radicalism and fight against the neoliberal establishment turned into a cynical betrayal of the Greek voters. So what we have with Pravda, we have the focus on the critique of economic policy in Russia, but we also have the international connection. So Pravda is connecting its struggle. The Communist Party in Russia is connecting its struggle to various protests in Europe. So it's trying essentially to support the other side in other countries in Europe and the world. This has been the first edition of the Russian newspaper Monitor. I very much hope that you like it. I welcome your comments and questions. And as I always say to my students at the end of every class, be cool and stay cool till we see each other next time. Bye-bye and thank you.